For decades, one fish has been public enemy number one in the American heartland. It clogs rivers by the millions, it launches itself out of the water hard enough to break bones, and it has resisted every weapon humans have thrown at it. But something strange is happening in parts of the Illinois River system. The numbers are shifting, and the reason has almost nothing to do with the billion-dollar defenses built to stop them. It has to do with a fish nobody expected to matter at all. This is the story of how America's most hated fish met its match, and how the answer to a modern invasion turned out to be something ancient. The fish causing all this trouble aren't native to the United States at all. Back in the early 1970s, southern fish farmers imported several species of Asian carp, mainly bighead carp and silver carp, for a very practical reason. These fish are filter feeders, meaning they survive by straining algae and plankton out of the water instead of hunting other animals. Catfish farmers use them as a kind of biological pool cleaner, letting the carp keep pond water clear so their real product, the catfish, could grow without competing for oxygen or getting choked out by algae blooms. It worked well enough in a controlled pond. But ponds flood. Levees fail. Heavy rain events in the Mississippi River Basin during the 1970s and 1980s sent water and carp spilling out of aquaculture facilities and into open waterways. Once in the wild, the carp didn't need anyone's help anymore. The Mississippi River system is one of the largest interconnected waterways on the planet, stretching through more than 30 states, and it offered these fish an almost limitless buffet with virtually nothing standing in their way. Within a few decades, Asian carp had pushed north through the Mississippi and into its major tributaries, including the Illinois River, one of the most heavily affected waterways in the country. In some surveys, carp now make up the overwhelming majority of the biomass in certain stretches. In a few sections of the Illinois River, researchers have estimated that as much as 9 out of every 10 fish pulled from the water is a carp. That's not an ecosystem with an invasive species problem. That's an ecosystem that has been functionally replaced. What makes Asian carp uniquely dangerous isn't aggression. They don't attack other fish, and they're not predators in the traditional sense. Their advantage is pure biological efficiency. A single adult carp can consume roughly 20% of its body weight in plankton every day. Multiply that by a population numbering in the tens of millions, and you get an animal that doesn't compete with native fish so much as erase the foundation they depend on. Native species like paddlefish, bigmouth buffalo, and various minnow species all rely on the same plankton and algae at the bottom of the food chain. When carp strip that resource away at an industrial scale, everything above it in the food web starts to starve. Then there's reproduction. A mature female silver carp can release anywhere from a few 100,000 to over 1 million eggs in a single spawning season, and those offspring can reach reproductive maturity in as little as 2 to 3 years. It's a population growth curve that looks less like gradual expansion and more like compound interest running out of control. Removing carp from a river doesn't create a lasting dent because the survivors simply outreproduce the loss within a season or two. Silver carp specifically have also earned a reputation for being physically dangerous to humans, not because they bite or attack, but because of an odd nervous system quirk. They're extremely sensitive to vibration, and boat motors trigger a panic response that sends them leaping several feet into the air. On heavily infested stretches of river, a boat moving at speed can trigger dozens of fish jumping simultaneously, some weighing 15 to 20 pounds. Boaters have suffered concussions, broken noses, and fractured ribs from collisions with airborne carp. Some tournament organizers and recreational boaters have simply abandoned certain stretches of river altogether, unwilling to risk it. As destructive as the situation has become on inland rivers, the true nightmare scenario for scientists and policymakers is what happens if Asian carp ever establish a breeding population in the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes system holds roughly 20% of the entire planet's surface freshwater and supplies drinking water to tens of millions of people across the US and Canada. It also supports a commercial and recreational fishing industry worth billions of dollars annually, built around native species like walleye, yellow perch, and lake trout. Lake Erie is considered the most vulnerable entry point. It's the shallowest of the 5 Great Lakes, the warmest, and it happens to have exactly the kind of nutrient-rich, plankton-heavy water that bighead and silver carp thrive in. Multiple modeling studies conducted by fisheries biologists have concluded that if a self-sustaining carp population took hold in Lake Erie, the fish could realistically spread throughout the interconnected Great Lakes system within a matter of years, not decades. Unlike a river, a lake doesn't funnel a population toward a single downstream endpoint. There's no current pushing the fish in one predictable direction, no narrowing channel where defenses can concentrate their effect. Once carp establish themselves in open lake water, there's no proven method for eradicating them. It would be, by most expert assessments, irreversible. For more than 2 decades, the primary line of defense has centered on a series of electric barriers installed in the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, a man-made waterway that connects the Mississippi River Basin to Lake Michigan, essentially the only direct water link between the two systems. These barriers send continuous electrical pulses through the water, strong enough to repel or stun fish attempting to cross, without harming the barges and boat traffic that still use the canal for commerce. The system has held for over 20 years, but it isn't foolproof. The barriers require constant maintenance. They're vulnerable during major flood events when water levels and currents behave unpredictably, and researchers have found evidence suggesting some fish may occasionally slip through, particularly smaller carp that generate a weaker electrical response. Because of those vulnerabilities, the Army Corps of Engineers has been developing a much larger project at the Brandon Road Lock and Dam in Illinois, a multi-layered barrier system combining electric fields, underwater sound deterrence, an air bubble curtain, and a specially engineered flushing lock designed to physically wash smaller fish back downstream. The estimated cost runs past $1 billion, and the project has faced repeated delays, including funding disputes between state and federal agencies and the discovery that part of the planned construction site sits on land contaminated with legacy industrial waste. Alongside the engineering efforts, state agencies in Illinois have paid commercial fishing crews to physically remove carp from infested waterways. Over roughly 15 years, these harvesting operations have pulled tens of millions of pounds of carp out of the Illinois River system, sometimes netting hundreds of thousands of pounds in a single coordinated push. Illinois even launched a marketing campaign to rebrand the fish for human consumption under the name Kopi, short for copious, hoping that turning the invader into a menu item might create enough commercial demand to make harvesting self-sustaining. None of it has been enough to reverse the trend. The barriers hold a line. The harvesting thins local populations temporarily, but the overall carp population across the river system has continued to persist, propped up by a reproductive rate that easily outpaces every removal effort combined. For years, the entire conversation around Asian carp focused on one question: how do we stop them from advancing? But a smaller group of biologists started asking a different question entirely, not how to fight the invasion, but why the invasion succeeded so completely in the first place. Rivers that had supported diverse, balanced fish populations for thousands of years collapsed under pressure from carp in a matter of decades. That kind of total ecological takeover usually doesn't happen in a healthy system. It happens in a system with a missing piece. The answer, it turns out, had been sitting in plain historical record the entire time. Long before Asian carp ever arrived in North America, the rivers of the central United States had an apex predator suited almost perfectly to controlling exactly this kind of population explosion: the alligator gar. The alligator gar is one of the largest freshwater fish native to North America, capable of growing past 8 feet in length and exceeding 200 pounds. It's covered in thick, diamond-shaped ganoid scales, so dense that early American settlers reportedly used them as makeshift arrowheads and even armor plating. Its long snout is lined with a double row of sharp teeth, giving it an appearance that looks almost prehistoric, and for good reason. The species has existed in something close to its current form for tens of millions of years, predating most of the fish species we consider common today. Historically, alligator gar ranged from the Gulf Coast states north through the Mississippi and Illinois river systems. As an opportunistic apex predator, it fed on whatever abundant prey species were available in its environment, which for most of its evolutionary history meant smaller native rough fish. In doing so, it acted as a natural population control mechanism, keeping fast-breeding species from ever reaching the kind of runaway numbers that require modern intervention. Then, over the course of the 20th century, the alligator gar was systematically wiped out of the northern parts of its range. It was widely regarded by anglers and state agencies as a trash fish, a supposed threat to more desirable sportfish, and was actively targeted for removal in many regions. At the same time, large-scale river engineering projects, including dams and levees built for flood control and shipping, cut the gar off from the shallow, seasonally flooded backwaters it depends on for spawning. Without access to those breeding grounds, gar populations couldn't sustain themselves even where they weren't being actively hunted. By the 1970s, the alligator gar had effectively disappeared from Illinois and much of the surrounding region. The last confirmed catch in the state dates to the 1960s, and for decades afterward, the species was considered locally extinct across most of the northern Mississippi basin. Here's where the timeline becomes impossible to ignore. The alligator gar vanished from the northern river systems by the 1970s. Asian carp escaped into those exact same waterways during that same decade. These weren't two unrelated events happening to overlap. They were connected. The rivers that Asian carp invaded weren't thriving, balanced ecosystems that simply got overwhelmed by a superior competitor. They were ecosystems that had already lost their primary check on exactly this kind of population explosion, years before the carp ever arrived. Every engineered defense built since then, the electric barriers, the harvesting programs, the marketing campaigns, has essentially functioned as an artificial replacement for a role that a living predator used to fill for free, simply by existing in the water. And artificial replacements, it turns out, are expensive, high maintenance, and never quite as effective as the real thing. That realization led a small coalition of state and federal wildlife agencies, along with conservation groups, to try something that had nothing to do with fighting carp directly. Starting around 2010, Illinois and several neighboring states began raising alligator gar in hatcheries and releasing them back into restored floodplain wetlands and backwater habitats across the state. The original goal wasn't pest control, it was ecological restoration, an attempt to bring back a native species that had been missing for half a century. Young gar are raised to at least a foot in length before release, giving them a better chance of avoiding predators in the wild. They've since been reintroduced to dozens of sites across Illinois, some located farther north than the species had swum in living memory. But alligator gar are opportunistic feeders by nature. They don't specialize in one prey type, they eat whatever is most abundant in their environment. And in the restored backwaters of the Illinois River, the most abundant food source, by a wide margin, happens to be young Asian carp. So, without any deliberate design to weaponize the species against the invasion, the returning gar began preying heavily on juvenile carp, the exact life stage where population control has the greatest long-term impact, since a carp that never survives to breeding age never contributes to the next generation's explosive numbers. It's worth being honest about the scale of what's actually happening here. The biologists running these reintroduction programs are careful not to oversell the results. Alligator gar grow slowly, reproduce slowly, and currently exist in the wild in relatively small, scattered numbers compared to a carp population still measured in the tens of millions. No wildlife agency involved in the program claims that gar alone can control carp populations across an entire river system. In the stretches where carp numbers have measurably declined, most of that progress still comes from the netting and harvesting operations, not from gar predation. What the gar appears to offer instead is something more incremental, a slow, self-sustaining pressure that doesn't require annual funding, doesn't break down during a flood, and doesn't need to be rebuilt every few years. It's a natural process picking back up where it left off 50 years ago, working alongside the engineered defenses rather than replacing them. The situation now comes down to a kind of race between two very different timelines. On one side, Asian carp continue pressing north toward the Great Lakes, and the aging electric barrier system remains vulnerable to a bad enough flood or mechanical failure. On the other side, alligator gar populations are slowly reestablishing themselves backwater by backwater, rebuilding an ecological balance that took a century of human intervention to dismantle. Nobody studying this issue can say with confidence which clock will win. Gar reproduction and growth happen on a scale of years and decades. Carp reproduction happens on a scale of months. The most likely outcome, According to most of the researchers involved, isn't that one solution triumphs over the other, but that the combination of engineered barriers, active harvesting, and restored natural predation together provide enough cumulative pressure to keep the carp contained, assuming all three continue to receive the resources and attention they need. What the alligator gar's return does demonstrate, though, is a lesson that extends well beyond this one river system. Ecological invasions rarely succeed purely because the invader is unstoppable. More often, they succeed because something that used to stand in the way was removed first. The Asian carp didn't conquer these rivers by force. They walked through a door that had already been left open, a door that, one hatchery-raised fish at a time, is finally starting to close again.